Good day. Today is Sunday, 23rd March 2025, and there continues to be more information about Russian advances in Ukraine and the critical situation of Ukrainian troops, the remaining Ukrainian troops in Kursk region. But it's also the case that apparently tomorrow the three parties to the conflict, the three main parties to the conflict, the United States, Russia, and Ukraine, are going to meet in Riyadh for the first of the meetings of the various expert groups who are going to be discussing possible ceasefires and how to implement them, and how the existing ceasefire, the 30-day ceasefire on attacks on energy systems, can be agreed and perhaps extended. Now, we've had some information about who is going to be leading the delegations that are being sent by the respective parties to Riyadh. And the thing that struck me immediately is that there is a major difference between the American and Russian delegations on the one hand and the Ukrainian delegation. Ukraine's delegation is going to be headed by Ukraine's defense minister, Rustem Umerov. Apparently, another official, Pavlo Palisa, who is a close associate and aide of Zelensky's, will also be participating, as well as one of Zelensky's foreign policy advisors, Igor Zhovka. Several Ukrainian military officers will be participating as well. So that is a very high-powered delegation consisting of, well, important people headed by the country's defense minister. The Americans and the Russians are not sending to Riyadh delegations of anything like the same strength. So the American delegation is going to be headed by an official, Andrew Peake, who is apparently on the permanent staff of the National Security Council, and his major assistant will be Michael Anton, who is head of policy planning at the State Department. No doubt, very important, experienced men, but hardly big names, certainly not people at cabinet rank within the US government or anything like that, which of course Rustem Umerov, the Ukrainian defense minister who's heading the Ukrainian delegation, he does obviously have cabinet rank. Now, the interesting thing is that the Russian delegation is pitched at the same level of strength as the American delegation is. And we've been provided with information by Interfax, Russian news agency, which is unofficial, it's not directly controlled by the Russian government, and they provided us with some indications of who will be leading the Russian delegation, and some information about what the Russian delegation is going to be doing. So this is the report from Interfax. Russian Federation Council member Grigory Karasin, an advisor to the Federal Security Service director Sergei Beseda, will lead a Russian delegation at consultations of expert groups with the United States on the Black Sea Initiative that will take place in Riyadh on March 24th. Russian presidential aide for international affairs Yuri Ushakov told journalists. And then Ushakov confirms that he has been in contact, he's been speaking further with Mike Waltz. Ushakov, of course, is Putin's main foreign policy aide, mainly focused on relations with the United States. Mike Waltz is Donald Trump's national security advisor, and they obviously are fulfilling the role of chief negotiators on each side. So, alongside Steve Witkoff, who appears to have a similar role for the United States. Anyway, Ushakov went on to say this. Mr. Waltz and I agreed that consultations on this account, that's to say specifically on the Black Sea, will take place in a bilateral format by experts appointed by the presidents. The consultations will take place in Riyadh on Monday, March 24th. Head of the Federation Council Foreign Affairs Committee, Grigory Karasin, and advisor to the Federal Security Service Director, Sergei Besieda, will participate in them on the Russian side. And Ushakov has said this directly after having a telephone call with Mike Waltz. And then Ushakov described these Russian officials as follows. These are generally experienced negotiators who know international problems well. And then we're told that he had a call with Waltz on March 19th. And US National Security Advisor Mike Waltz said yesterday that we had a phone call. I would like to confirm that such a conversation did take place and that he speaks to Waltz. Ushakov said that he now speaks to Waltz regularly. Now, Karasin is a member of the upper house of the Russian parliament. So he is a parliamentarian. He is a director, the chair of the Russian upper house, is the upper house of the Russian parliament. He's the chair of its foreign affairs committee. So he's clearly somebody who is familiar with foreign policy. And apparently, as I understand it, he is a diplomat. His previous career was in the foreign ministry, and he is an experienced diplomat. Now, the other person who's heading the delegation is Sergei Besieda. Now, Besieda is an advisor to the Federal Security Service, the FSB. Now, the FSB is a counterintelligence agency. It's involved mostly with internal security. It does occasionally carry out spying missions overseas, but it is a misunderstanding to think of it as an intelligence service in the way that, say, the CIA is. Its major role is internal. It has emerged out of the former Soviet KGB. In fact, it has many of the core functions of the original KGB. And I understand that the chairman of the FSB works from the Lubyanka, the headquarters, the former headquarters of the KGB, one of the most famous buildings in Moscow, located very close to the Kremlin, a building with an famous, or if you prefer, perhaps more appropriately, infamous record in Soviet and Russian history. So Sergei Besieda is essentially a counterintelligence officer. And this is interesting because it does beg the question of why someone like Besieda should have been chosen for this task as opposed to a military official. And I'm going to guess that the reason is that as far as the Russians are concerned, the primary purpose of the meeting tomorrow will be to discuss the situation in the Black Sea. The Russians have been concerned about sabotage attempts that the Ukrainians have attempted against the Turk Stream pipeline, which transits the Black Sea. That falls squarely within the counterintelligence functions of the FSB. And the Russians are also historically have been concerned about the smuggling of weapons, or at least the transit of weapons to Ukraine via Ukraine's Black Sea ports, Odessa and such, through commercial ships which supposedly are participating in the food export trade. So all of that, together with what Ushakov says about the talks tomorrow, suggests to me that the Russians see these talks tomorrow as essentially being about how to sort out the return, in effect, to the grain deal in the Black Sea. They want to discuss this with the US, and the US is sending officials at an analogous level in order to assist, or rather to work with the Russians to that objective. So we have here, I'm not going to say low-level, low-ranking delegations, but delegations which do generally seem to be expert groups tasked with implementing a decision basically to stop strikes against commercial shipping in the Black Sea, to see how that can be implemented and enforced in a way that didn't happen after the grain deal was first entered into in 2022. The Russians have complained many times that the Ukrainians and the Western allies took advantage of the grain deal to import weapons into Ukraine, and the Russians seem to be determined that if something like that is set up again, this won't happen. And that is why a security official, Sergei Besieda, is participating in these talks. Now, the Ukrainians clearly have a completely different perspective. They're sending their defense minister, they're sending military officials, and one wonders again why they are doing that. Well, here is my take of this. The Americans and the Russians have set up expert groups. This has been agreed by Ushakov and by Waltz to sort out the arrangements in the Black Sea. The Russians and the Americans envisage the discussions in Riyadh tomorrow being principally with each other. The Ukrainians are coming again to try to gate crash those talks. They don't just want to be there on the sidelines. They want to come in, involve themselves in these discussions, and not only involve themselves in discussions about the Black Sea, they want to try to change the entire direction of the discussions. They want to broaden them, to try to extend them, to make them into discussions about an overall ceasefire, and from Ukraine's perspective, preferably a ceasefire that takes into account strikes in the air and by sea, not just missile strikes against energy systems and attacks on shipping in the Black Sea, but a full-scale, complete ceasefire involving a cessation of all air attacks, including air attacks by Russian aircraft, operations in the Black Sea, that kind of thing. The proposal that was made about 10 days ago, firstly by Emmanuel Macron, and which was then adopted by Zelensky, and which was the proposal, apparently, that the Ukrainians took with them when they met with the Americans in Jeddah, only to find that the Americans were not interested in that proposal. So the Ukrainians are coming to the meeting tomorrow with a completely different agenda from the agenda that the Russians and the Americans are following. The Russians and the Americans see this as a discussion between experts to fulfill a decision already made by the American and Russian presidents, Putin and Trump, over the course of their telephone conversation last week. The Ukrainians want to take the agreement of those two presidents as the starting point for something completely different, and that's what they're planning to do at the talks in Riyadh. Now, this is all very interesting, and it is very much in character with what the Ukrainians have consistently been attempting to do. I think the Russians certainly are going to resist all such proposals. They will no doubt insist that the topic of discussion be the one that was agreed, the narrow one of what is happening in the Black Sea. The Ukrainians probably will find that the Americans will side with the Russians on this. I cannot imagine that these middle-ranking officials from the American side who've Mr. Anton and Mr. Peake will feel empowered to extend the discussion in the way that the Ukrainians appear to want. And I suspect that the Ukrainians will come back from the meeting in Riyadh disappointed. Notice again that Ushakov clearly assumes that the negotiation in Riyadh is going to be directly between the Americans and the Russians. Mr. Waltz and I agreed that consultations on this account in a bilateral format, in other words, between the Americans and the Russians, will be held by experts appointed by the presidents. So, it's another example. What we're looking at is another example of the Ukrainians attempting, in effect, to gatecrash the talks. Now, that is perhaps a little ungenerous to the Ukrainians in the sense that, obviously, given, even if this was only a discussion about the situation in the Black Sea, the Ukrainians would have to be involved at some level because presumably they would be expected to agree and to implement any agreement that the Americans and the Russians decide with each other. So one would expect a Ukrainian delegation to participate at some level, or Ukrainian representatives to be present at some level in the talks in Riyadh, but not at the very high-powered level that the Ukrainians are sending. And that, as I said, suggests a complex and contentious discussion tomorrow, with the Ukrainians attempting to introduce new issues which the Americans and the Russians have never discussed or talked about up to now. Now, all that is very interesting in itself, but it is also true that Zelensky in particular, but the Ukrainians generally, have been busy trying to give a completely different spin on what Trump and Zelensky, what Trump and Putin agreed with each other when they spoke with each other last Tuesday. Now, the Russian readout makes it quite clear, crystal clear, that the agreement was for a 30-day cessation, mutual cessation of attacks on energy infrastructure, basically power stations. The Russians will not attack Ukrainian power stations and the facilities that are connected to those power stations, and the Ukrainians will also not attack during that same 30-day period parts of the gigantic Russian energy complex. Now, note that everybody assumes that this ceasefire is now in place, but there's been no mutual statement that I'm aware of that says that. And nobody has ever said when exactly, from which day exactly, this ceasefire came into effect. Was it from the day that Putin and Trump spoke, which was on Tuesday, or was it when Trump and Zelensky spoke on the following day? And Zelensky agreed to abide by the ceasefire. No one knows. I mean, at least I don't know. Maybe there's been some agreement between the parties as to when this ceasefire is supposed to start, but I don't know what it is. I've never seen a formal announcement that says that the ceasefire begins from, say, 0600 hours on the 22nd of March or whatever. I mean, I've never seen anything like that. So it's not certain to me whether this ceasefire even exists or not. Just to say, presumably it does. Everybody talks and acts and speaks as if it does. We'll go into that in a moment. But for the moment, as I said, I've not seen anybody actually come forward and say that this ceasefire is in effect. But the Ukrainians, Zelensky, are already trying to spin the ceasefire to mean something more than what Trump and Putin clearly agreed with each other. Now, the Russian readout, as I said, makes it absolutely clear that it is a 30-day truce on attacks on the respective energy systems. The American readout, published a few hours later, which has a strange history. As I said, it has never... well, when I last saw it, it had still not appeared on the White House website, but you can find it in all kinds of other places. The Americans have produced a readout. It's just that it's not been given quite the level of publicity that one might have expected, and its language altogether is rather vague. Anyway, it somewhat fudges the matter because it talks about cessation of attacks on energy and infrastructure, an energy and infrastructure ceasefire. Now, that doesn't contradict the Russian readout because, to me, it's quite clear that the attacks on an energy and infrastructure ceasefire clearly means infrastructure that relates to the energy system. But it's not completely unambiguous. And by the way, the White House readout also doesn't refer to any limit of 30 days. Having said that, the Americans have provided clarity following this. The readout of Trump's call to Zelensky clearly made it clear that it was a partial ceasefire against energy. And Witkoff, in his various conversations with Tucker Carlson and others, has also made it quite clear that it is a temporary ceasefire of attacks on energy systems. Well, Zelensky has been trying to imply that it is altogether a ceasefire covering not just energy facilities, but infrastructure in general. Railways, ports, bridges, that sort of thing. Now, I can understand why Ukraine might want that, but to be very clear, it's not what was agreed. It's quite clear, if you look at all the readouts together, that it was not what what Trump and Putin agreed with each other, and what Zelensky agreed to the following day when he spoke to Trump. Now, over the last couple of hours, we've been hearing that the Ukrainians are going to come along to Riyadh with a long list of facilities which they say should be covered by the ceasefire. And some reports suggest that these include ports and bridges and railway systems and all of those other things which go well beyond the ceasefire that Trump and Putin agreed with each other. Now, I don't know what the Russians are going to say about this, but my guess is that Karasin and Beseda will say that they have no authority to discuss these issues. They have come to Riyadh for the specific purpose that they were instructed to come, which is to discuss attacks on shipping in the Black Sea. So, again, we are likely to see a collision in Riyadh. And once again, it will be very interesting and very revealing to see which side the Americans come down on. Will they agree with the Russians that this is a meeting to discuss the situation in the Black Sea, or will they go along with the Ukrainians and side with the Ukrainians in order to try to get the ceasefire extended? This is going to be an important test for the future of the negotiations. If the Russians see the Americans siding with the Ukrainians, then that might cause concern in Moscow and lead to doubts about whether this process might not be going completely off the rails. If the Russians start to give ground on these issues, that could open the way to criticism and dissension in Moscow, though I don't expect that they will. I've said already, and what I discussed yesterday about Putin's comments to the industrialists, which also took place on Tuesday, all of that suggests that the Russians are going to stick to their positions and that they're not in any mood to bend or make concessions of that nature at the present time. If, on the other hand, which I think more likely, the Americans also politely explain to the Ukrainians that the purpose of this meeting is to focus on the situation in the Black Sea. That is what Waltz and Ushakov agreed with each other. Then it's difficult to avoid the feeling that the Ukrainians will feel that they've been left out in the cold again, and they will be angry and resentful, and there will be more complaints and more criticisms from Zelensky. So this meeting tomorrow in Riyadh is perhaps not a particularly important meeting in and of itself. It's a meeting in a narrow format to discuss a specific issue, the question of shipping, commercial shipping in the Black Sea. But the way it is conducted, what comes out of that meeting, might give us a sense of where the negotiation is going, whether it is indeed the case of the Americans and the Russians working together, and whether, in fact, actual progress is made on the Black Sea, and whether, in fact, the Ukrainian attempts to expand the ceasefire, to get it to cover other matters, to come closer to the kind of ceasefire that Macron and Zelensky, and by the way, Starmer, have all advocated, which is a full cessation of all military activity in the air and by sea, opening the way, by the way, for the imposition of a Western no-fly zone over Western Ukraine. Whether, as I said, that particular if the Russians sense that that's where it's going, I can imagine they will be angry. And if the Russians take a firm line and it doesn't happen, the Ukrainians and their European friends will sense that this is indeed a process, that the Americans and the Russians are taking hold, are running with together, and that the Ukrainians and the Europeans are being left out in the cold. Now, Wickoff, in that conversation he had with Tucker Carlson, talked all about this, or at least he didn't talk about this specifically, but he did talk about the Europeans, and he had quite a lot to say about Keir Starmer, and to put it mildly, it was not flattering. I'm going to just briefly report how the BBC is covering it. Sir Keir Starmer's plan for an international force to support a ceasefire in Ukraine has been dismissed as, quote, a posture and pose by Donald Trump's special envoy. Steve Witkoff said the idea was based on a, quote, simplistic notion of the UK Prime Minister and other European leaders thinking, quote, we have all got to be like Winston Churchill. And, well, those words have been widely reported in Britain. They've not gone down at all well in Whitehall, in where the British government is located, even though the British officials are clearly under instructions not to respond to them. Now, Wickoff isn't just Trump's representative, and in some respects the US's chief negotiator. He is clearly also a close friend and confidant of Donald Trump's. He made that very clear during the interview he had with Tucker Carlson. And, well, I'm fairly certain that what Wickoff said about Starmer, basically that he has a Churchill complex, and that he's talking about an international force to support a ceasefire, being just a posture and a pose. I'm pretty sure that reflects closely, in fact, is identical to Trump's own opinion. Just saying. Now, if I'm right, then that suggests to me that tomorrow the Americans and the Russians will work together, and the Ukrainians, and by extension, the Europeans will be left out firmly in the cold. And it will also probably mean a further increase in tension between Washington and Kiev, obviously, but also Washington and London. And not just Washington and London, but Washington and the Europeans generally. The Europeans will start to feel that they're being not just kept out, which they are, but that they are being thrown out, that they're being treated without any respect by an American leadership that basically considers that they have a Winston Churchill complex, that they engage in simplistic thinking, and that they're indulging in postures and poses, all of which is true. So we could start to see stress and tension between the Europeans and the Americans start to increase again over the next few weeks. So an important meeting tomorrow, and as I said, one which will get us a sense of where we are going. If the Russians feel that the Americans are siding with the Ukrainians and with the Europeans and are trying to get the ceasefire extended in the way that the Europeans and the Ukrainians want. In other words, to become a ceasefire which evolves into a no-fly zone, then there is a very real possibility that the Russians will dig in and will start to become more obstructive about discussions leading to a ceasefire, because obviously for them, they will not agree to a no-fly zone over Ukraine under any circumstances at all. So anyway, there we are. That's the meeting tomorrow. That's Witkoff's view of Starmer. Deeply unflattering. And I am pretty sure, as I said, that this is not just Witkoff's view of Starmer. It is also Trump's and Vance's and various other people's. Now, I ought to say, since we're talking about American attitudes to the European leadership, there was apparently another rather shocking moment. Apparently, Vance, I haven't followed this closely, but there are reports circulating that there was another big meeting of Western leaders. Ursula von der Leyen was present and apparently started to give a speech. And Vance, who was there, J.D. Vance, the US vice president, apparently left the room as soon as Ursula began speaking. And there are reports now starting to appear in the German media that Ursula's time as the Queen of Europe is now coming to an end. Apparently, she and Friedrich Merz detest each other. It's a sort of personal loathing that goes back a long way, when Ursula was an ally of Merz's nemesis, Angela Merkel. And apparently there's never been any kind of reconciliation. And supposedly Merz is one of those people who bears grudges and keeps his grudges, and he's never come to terms with Ursula at all. I'm going to say something else on this. It's not just a question of Merz and Ursula not liking each other. It is about feeling in Berlin that over the last 3 years, as a result of the weak leadership of Scholz, the German Chancellor, and the chaotic government that has existed in Berlin, that the European Commission, the European Centre, has become over-dominant and has slipped out of Berlin's control. The German establishment absolutely believes in European unity, European integration. They are absolutely in favour of that. On that, they don't disagree with the European Commission, with the Central European institutions at all, but they do have their own perspective as to who should lead that process. They do not believe it should be a bunch of bureaucrats in Brussels. They believe the leadership of that project should come from Berlin, from the capital of what is by far the most powerful EU state. That has been the consistent reality since Helmut Kohl's time, and they don't see any reason why it should change. So I suspect that Merz will want to put Ursula in her place, because from this point onwards, he thinks that he should be the king of Europe, and Europe doesn't need a queen, certainly not when that queen is Ursula, alongside the king, who, as I said, must be Friedrich Merz. So I suspect that those tensions are there and that they're going to grow. Coming back to a topic that I touched on in my program yesterday about how, well, yesterday and the day before, about how Starmer's coalition of the willing is starting to break down, how more and more European countries are drifting away and are no longer willing to put up troops to send to Ukraine, how Starmer is falling back on the idea of a no-fly zone patrolled by the British and French Air Force, how there's been apparently angry exchanges between people like Spanish Prime Minister Sanchez and the EU's High Representative for Foreign Policy, Kaja Kallas. Well, with this feud between Merz and Ursula, we now have a further indicator of German division. And I'm going to make a further prediction that as Germany attempts its great rearmament program, which I doubt will get very far, but as the stresses grow, antipathy and antagonism between the two big centres of power within the European Union, Berlin and Brussels, will start to exacerbate. Anyway, I don't want to be sidetracked for too long about all of this. Suffice to say, there's already reasons to think that we're going to have tense discussions tomorrow, discussions that may prove to be more complicated and more difficult than the Americans expect. And the outcome of those discussions could be more stress in the relationship between Ukraine and the Trump White House, and more stress between the Trump White House and the Europeans, with clear, obvious signs now that the Americans don't think much of the Europeans at the present time. Now, that brings me now back to the question, the perennial question of the state of the war. And I'm going to first of all touch on this question of the no-fly zone and all of this. Now, over the course of last night, the Russians conducted another massive attack, aerial attack, on large areas of Ukraine. Mostly, it was carried out by Uranium-2 drones. There were lots of drone strikes on Kiev itself, the capital. There's lots of really very, very vivid pictures of flashes and bangs and fires all across Kiev as a result of this drone strike. There is very little evidence anywhere in Ukraine of the Ukrainian air defense system operating to any degree. In fact, it seems to have been running out of ability to defend Ukraine since the late spring of 2024. Every month since then, when the Russians have conducted drone or missile strikes, we see that the Ukrainians are having more difficulty putting up strong air defenses to bring down the drones and the missiles. And as I said yesterday, it appears to have been mainly Russian drones attacking Kiev. As I said, lots of pictures of explosions across Kiev, but also other places too. Odessa was particularly badly hit, and apparently the city of Zaporozhye as well. And in the case of Odessa and Zaporozhye, I suspect that what the Russians were striking at was facilities where the Ukrainians were storing, or the Russians believed the Ukrainians were storing, military equipment supplied to Ukraine by the West. Now, there are a lot of things to say about this particular missile and drone strike by the Russians. Notice that it doesn't seem to have extended to energy infrastructure. So for the moment, the Russians clearly are treating the 30-day truce on strikes on the Ukrainian energy system as being in effect, and we'll come to that further shortly. But not only do we see an absence of Ukrainian air defenses, but this big missile strike, this big drone strike by the Russians, again highlighted some fundamental realities about the state of the war in the air. Now, a couple of months ago, back in August of last year, the first reports appeared that the first F-16 fighter jets were reaching Ukraine. And then we got a report a short time after that the first Ukrainian F-16 to take to the air over Ukraine had crashed, and it was assumed that this was the result either of pilot error or that it had been shot down by Ukraine's own air defenses. Mariana Bezuglaya, by the way, the dissident Ukrainian MP, has said that around half of Ukraine's air losses are the result of friendly fire by Ukraine's own air defense system. A claim which I find it impossible either to confirm or refute, by the way. But anyway, that was what she said. What has happened to the F-16 since then? There were some reports a couple of weeks ago that the F-16s had been deployed to shoot down Russian missiles heading towards targets across Ukraine. But, well, there were some reports about that, but fairly little was said. Then a couple of days ago, unofficial reports in Russia started to claim that the first F-16 had been shot down by the Russian Air Force over the conflict area, that the Ukrainian F-16 was trying to support the Ukrainian military in the Kursk region. Anyway, that was the first report that the Russians had shot down an F-16, though I noticed that it was never, I haven't yet seen any confirmation from the Russian Defense Ministry. Maybe there was, and I just missed it. But overall, what has been happening to the F-16s? There was that first delivery in August of last year. Then there was some more sent a bit later. Then we got reports that one EU country was, I think it was from memory, I think it was Denmark, was postponing delivery of some of the F-16s it was due to supply until next year, until 2026, in other words. But what has happened to them? Well, as far as I can see, they're not taking off. Probably because the Russians are attacking the airfields, and as is universally acknowledged, the airfields, the F-16 requires long and carefully maintained airfields, and many people were saying that this would be something impossible to acquire, to achieve in Ukraine itself. But Ukrainian officials are now coming forth and are complaining that the F-16 anyway is no match to the Russian fighters it is pitted against. That the Sukhoi 35 of the Russian Air Force, of which, by the way, the Russians have a growing number, comprehensively outmatches it. And one gets the sense that the Ukrainians are very, very nervous to deploy their F-16s to battle in any situation where they might be pitted against the Russian Air Force. Now, that brings us back to all of these ceasefire discussions, because the Western powers have been talking about a no-fly zone over western Ukraine. The Russians, as I said, will oppose that. There's been reports about the state of the British and French air forces. I think it's fair to say that it's a mixed bag. There's some very good pilots, and there's some very decent aircraft, but it doesn't look as if they're in much of a condition by themselves to take on the Russian Air Force. And we see the problems that the Ukrainians are having with their F-16s. And of course, many European air forces either still fly F-16s or they rely on aircraft which are also fourth generation fighter jets, like the F-16 itself is. Aircraft, in other words, of the same broad technological level as the F-16, which is currently outmatched by the Russian Air Force. So these are the problems that the Europeans have with any one of the projects for no-fly zones, for ceasefires, functioning only over the air and the sea, obviously for deployment of troops to Ukraine itself. The capabilities are not there because the Russians outmatch them. Now, that is not to say that the Russians are having it all their own way in the air. Photographs have now appeared of Engels, the Engels Air Base in Russia, and the satellite photos clearly show very extensive damage to many buildings on the base as a result of the recent drone attacks. Clearly, this was more than just a fuel fire. There was a major Ukrainian drone attack on the Engels Air Base, and some of the drones got through, and they do seem to have done real damage. Now, the Ukrainians are saying that they hit warehouses where Russian cruise missiles, KH-101s, were being stored, and other ammunition was being stored, and that this explains the extent of the explosions. And that may very well be true. I'm not in a position to confirm or refute that. I'm not there. I'm not in Engels, and nobody who serves in Engels is in a position is talking to me about what exactly was destroyed at that airbase. The fact is that some drones did get through, and they did do significant damage to buildings, though I'm not able to say, obviously, what was inside the buildings. The point is, and it's the same point that I have made many times, Ukraine can send large fleets of drones against Russia. What it cannot do with those drones is cause critical damage to Russian energy infrastructure or critical enough damage to Russian military facilities so as to compromise the Russian war effort. I don't know what happened in Engels. One would assume that by now this airbase that has been attacked several times would be well protected against missile and drone attacks. But clearly some drones did get through. That might be the result of technical faults. Maybe some of the air defense systems malfunctioned. These are complex pieces of equipment. It does happen. It may be that there was confusion and muddle on the part of some people and incompetence. It could be that reports that some kind of a ceasefire with the Ukrainians in terms of air attacks was circulating, and that for that reason the defences around Engels were stood down. I'm not going to speculate further because I simply don't know. But the point is, the Ukrainians can do a significant amount of damage to an airbase like Engels, as they've done to air bases in Crimea and in Zaporozhye region in the past. But does that change the overall direction of the war? The answer by now is conclusive. It is no. Whereas the damage the Russians are doing to Ukraine is crippling, and it is causing Ukraine to become over-dependent on the support of its Western allies, which means ultimately on the United States. So that is the fundamental difference. And to be clear, if the Americans pull out, the Europeans, as we've seen with the debacle of the F-16s, are not able to fill the gap. Now, obviously, this is not just a war which is being fought in the air. A lot else is going on the battlefronts, and we're getting more and more clarity and information about what is going on in Kursk region, where the Russians continue to insist that there is a Ukrainian force that is surrounded, and apparently they've told Donald Trump that they believe the 2,500 Ukrainian troops are trapped in Kursk region. And we've had a fair amount of information, and it mostly comes from Group of Forces North, though it is supplemented by drone footage. Briefly, it looks as if most of these Ukrainian troops who are trapped in a village called Guyevo, which appears regularly on the regular reports that Group of Forces North publishes, and in the area of the nearby village of Gogolyevka. Now, there was a very interesting report by one of the semi-dissident, semi-official Ukrainian Telegram channels. I believe it was Telegram. Anyway, this report said that Syrskyi has reported to Zelensky that the Ukrainians believe that at least 1,000 Ukrainian troops who were previously in Kursk region have been taken prisoner by the Russians. There's 1,000 men. Syrskyi has apparently also reported to Zelensky that only around 3,000 of the Ukrainian troops who were previously in Kursk region have managed to escape to Ukraine. And there are many thousands of others who are unaccounted for. Now, Resident estimates the total number of Ukrainian troops in Kursk region on the eve of the fall of Suja at around 10,000 men. So 1,000 captive, 2,500 trapped in Guyevo, 3,000 having escaped to Ukraine. Well, that still leaves a significant number who are unaccounted for. Perhaps they're still roaming around the forests inside Kursk region trying to escape. There's lots of reports of mini cauldrons all over Kursk region. It could be that Syrskyi's getting the figures for captives wrong, though my own sense is that the Russians and the Ukrainians, through the good offices of the Emir of Qatar, keep each other fairly well informed about the number of prisoners that they each have. So, well, you can do the maths, but it does look as if a huge disaster has unveiled, has overtaken the Ukrainians in Kursk, and that disaster is getting worse. There has been a long report in Reuters, this is of course a British news agency, finally acknowledging that there are increasing doubts in Ukraine about whether the Kursk operation was ever worthwhile. Well, as to that, I delivered my own opinion many times. It obviously wasn't. It has ended in a complete military defeat and an appalling disaster for the Ukrainians. And, well, as I said, this disaster continues, and there are, by the way, more reports of more Russian troops now entering Sumy region in various locations. Presumably, some kind of an offensive is going to be prepared in Sumy region once the Ukrainian troops in Kursk have been finally defeated. Just saying. Anyway, that's the news from Kursk region, except that there is one really rather bitter thing. The Ukrainians are now starting to acknowledge that their troops, and we're talking about mostly their troops in Guyevo, are running very short of supplies, and by supplies I mean food. Group of Forces North, in the bulletin that I read out yesterday, spoke about how the Ukrainians have been trying to drop food to these troops using drones, but that the drones haven't been able to get through to any degree. Apparently the reports that the men in Guyevo, in Kursk region, are short of food has been spreading in Ukraine itself. Apparently some parts of Ukrainian civil society and some of the families of some of the troops who are in Kursk are now trying to organize food supplies to be sent to these men. And there is apparently little understanding or acknowledgement that any food collected for them is not going to reach them because they are trapped. Now, Group of Forces North rather sourly is suggesting that this is basically a scam, that some Ukrainian officials are spreading the story in Ukraine that these troops in Kursk need food and that their families and friends and civil society organizations in Ukraine therefore need to supply the food, and that the real purpose is to collect food and other supplies which can then be, well, basically stolen in order to enable corrupt officials to enrich themselves. That's Group of Forces North. If that is the truth, that's what they say. If that is the truth, I have to say it would not surprise me in the slightest. It's the sort of thing, unfortunately, that one hears a lot about where Ukraine is concerned. But is it actually true? I don't know. Maybe all this is being done in good faith. It's just that with the Ukrainian authorities not admitting the reality that the troops in Guyevo and in Kursk region are indeed trapped and cut off, and with Zelensky refusing to order their surrender, the people in Ukraine still believe that there are means to help them, when in fact there aren't. Speaking of Zelensky, he apparently has been again on his regular tours of the battlefronts, and he's ended up in Kharkiv, and he's met Syrskyi and other Ukrainian military officials there. And there's been a lot of discussion and speculation about what he is doing in Kharkiv. And I'm going to make a suggestion that his major concern is that with the collapse of the forces, the Ukrainian defenses in Kursk region, with the probability that the Ukrainians are going to be pushed out of Kursk region completely, and with the further possibility that the Russians are going to launch an offensive towards Sumy region, he is now becoming worried about the stability of Ukrainian defenses as the whole of northern Ukraine. Perhaps he is also worried about the situation in Volchansk and Lipsy. I've recently seen maps of Volchansk, which appears to now show the entire town almost entirely under Russian control. So it looks as if that long and difficult battle, protracted because Group of Forces North had to refocus some of its attention, a lot of its attention on Kursk region, that particular battle is now coming to an end. The Russians have established a large bridgehead west of the Oskol River in Kharkiv region, and there is talk or fear that the Russian troops west of the Oskol River might eventually link up with Group of Forces North as it pushes south from Volchansk. We'll see. Anyway, it could be that Zelensky and his officials are now worried about the stability of the whole situation in northern Ukraine. And as I've discussed many times, for Zelensky, this remains the battlefield of priority. Anyway, yesterday I talked about the fact that the Battle of Chasiv Yar now really does seem to be in its final days, and I'm coming back to the view that it looks as if Chasiv Yar will finally pass completely under Russian control, probably this month. Now, there have been the usual sour comments that the Battle of Chasiv Yar has taken far longer than anybody expected, which, well, it's true. It's taken a very long time. Many people, I notice, are extending the timescale of the battle. I saw one person who claimed that the Battle of Chasiv Yar began 2 years ago. Well, 2 years ago, the Russians were just finished their capture of Bakhmut, which lies obviously to the east of Chasiv Yar, and were preparing to repel a Ukrainian counteroffensive. So you could say that the Battle of Chasiv Yar has been going on for something like a year. The reasons the Russians have taken as long as they have to capture Chasiv Yar is because they have never committed large numbers of troops to the task. Mostly the work has been done by one particular division, the 98th Airborne Guards Division, by my recollection. And that is not a very big force, and it's also had to encounter logistical issues being brought about by the fact that they've had to transport their equipment beyond the aqueduct, the Seversky Donets aqueduct, which is a significant obstruction. The major focus of Russian operations in this area has not been Chasiv Yar, it has been Toretsk, and that is consistent with Russian practice over the course of this war, which is to prioritize the defense of the major cities, Donetsk and Gorlovka, which were under Russian control before the special military operation began, just as Donetsk used to be regularly shelled from Avdiivka before Avdiivka was captured in February of last year. So the Russians needed to capture Toretsk because it was from Toretsk that the Ukrainians were able to shell and threaten Gorlovka. Now, Toretsk is once, and I suspect conclusively, back under Russian control, so it's not surprising that the Russians are now working to complete the Battle of Chasiv Yar, and I suspect it will be ended fairly soon. Now, elsewhere, the Russians, as I said, continue to advance. They've been pushing forward in southwestern Donbass. There's been multiple reports of Russian advances there, and the Ukrainians have continued to try to counterattack around Pokrovsk, but with little effect. I've been receiving reports, and one other person I know, Daniel Davis, has been receiving the same reports, that there is a major Russian build-up going on behind the battlefronts, and that a very, very large force has been assembled by the Russians to be launched in its next offense, in the next Russian offensive. And there's apparently been some frustration within the Russian military that Putin has not launched this force into battle already. Admittedly, there have been the problems with the Rasputitsa, but there's been some criticism in the military that he continues to conduct the war in a very measured way, that he doesn't conduct an all-out war in the way that he should do. He hasn't, for example, attacked the bridges over the Dnieper or done any of those things. And apparently, over the last couple of weeks, this internal criticism has been growing. Now, I have no way to measure that, but it would not surprise me if it were true. I spoke yesterday about the various internal pressures that Putin comes under, and I suspect that the military is not above exerting pressures of its own. If the negotiations over the next couple of weeks do not go well, then, well, the Russians continue anyway to advance in Donbass. But eventually the point may come when the pressure, the internal pressure on Putin to act more decisively becomes irresistible, in which case this very large Russian force, I've been told it numbers around 200,000 men in the northern sector alone, could be sent into battle. Now, if that happens, then, as I said, quite apart from the fact that the military situation in Ukraine continues to go against Ukraine, well, that could have a very decisive effect indeed. Now, this is all I'm going to say about Ukraine today. We're going to have to wait and see what comes out of these talks tomorrow. There's some suggestions that they could last as long as 2 days. Maybe there will be some agreement between the Americans and the Russians about the Black Sea. But judging from the strength of the Ukrainian delegation, they want to see more happen. And if they don't get it, we could see further steps towards escalation by the Ukrainians. And it's quite plausible that they might start to get frustrated even with the existing 30-day ceasefire. The Russian Foreign Ministry has published a very, very strong statement about Ukrainian actions with respect to the ceasefire. This was what the Russian Defense Ministry said yesterday. Despite the agreement initiated by the United States to refrain from strikes on energy infrastructure, an agreement Kiev ostensibly supported, the regime's treacherous attacks on Russian territory continue. On March 19th, a fuel depot in Kuban came under attack, followed by a strike on the Suja gas metering station in Kursk region on March 21st. In addition, there have been barbaric incidents of Ukrainian drones deliberately targeting residential buildings and social facilities. These reckless actions once again highlight Kiev's complete disregard for agreements and its lack of commitment to achieving peace. Just as in 2022, provocations are being used to derail the negotiation process. We issue a clear warning. If the Kiev regime persists in its destructive course, Russia reserves the right to respond, including with symmetric measures. In other words, the Russians are putting the Ukrainians and the Americans on warning that Russia's adherence to the 30-day ceasefire on attacks on energy systems should not be taken for granted. Now, I will make two quick observations about this Russian warning. The first is that it could be that the attack on the fuel depot in Kuban was not seen by the Ukrainians themselves as a breach of the ceasefire, because as of that time, perhaps they hadn't agreed to it. That may be unlikely, but it's possible. The Russians perhaps think that the ceasefire began on the day when Putin and Trump spoke, which was on the 13th of March. But it's not clear to me, as I said, when the ceasefire is supposed to have started. And as for the strike on the Suja gas metering station in Kursk region, well, Radovka the other day, this is the Russian newspaper which covers the war, associated that attack on the gas metering station with the overall crisis of the Ukrainian troops who are surrounded in Kursk region. It was an artillery strike, apparently, which perhaps was not planned so much as an attack on an energy facility, but rather part of an ongoing overall battle that is taking place in this area. Well, I'm going to say, I'm just mentioning these two things because I want to appear here to be, giving potentially both sides, setting up what both sides might say. But in terms of the strike on the fuel depot in Kuban on the 19th of March, I have to say I do find it difficult to believe that the Ukrainians didn't intend it in some way to undermine the ceasefire. If the Ukrainians decide that they're not getting out of this process what they want, this negotiating process, what they want, it's entirely possible that their attacks on Russia, their attempts to attack the energy system in Russia might start to escalate again. In which case, based on what the Russian Foreign Ministry said, the entire ceasefire might collapse. This is not impossible. The Ukrainians might try to do it in order to try to claim that it was the Russians who were violating the ceasefire. I suspect also that the Ukrainians might also feel that if the ceasefire did break down, that might put more pressure on Trump to come round to their way of thinking, given the extent of his own commitment to the process. And of course, the Ukrainians might do all of this in the sure knowledge that their European friends will back them. Just so. So it's not impossible that if the talks start to get bogged down And if the Ukrainians become frustrated with them, the entire ceasefire negotiation might break down. We shall see. I think that the Americans and the Russians are too committed to it politically to let that happen. I think if the Ukrainians do this, they will be playing a very dangerous game. But it is not impossible that that is what they might choose to do. Now, world affairs are not limited to what's going on in Ukraine. 2 days ago, President Erdogan of Turkey arrested the mayor of Istanbul, who happens to be the opposition leader who is assumed to be most likely to defeat President Erdogan in a future presidential election. And entirely unsurprisingly, this has provoked major protests in Istanbul. The arrest, nobody, it seems, is taking very seriously. The allegations of corruption that the Turkish authorities are levelling against the mayor, they might be true. I mean, officials are corrupt in many countries. Turkey is not immune to corruption. But I, too, have to say that I don't really believe that that was the reason why he was arrested. If Erdogan suddenly is worried about corruption, well, there are many more examples of it much closer to himself. Just saying. Anyway, there are huge protests. Erdogan is threatening some kind of crackdown on the protesters. Turkey is looking somewhat less stable again. This despite the fact that Trump and Erdogan apparently had a very, very friendly and good conversation with each other. Now, my own view is that Erdogan has an intensely loyal electoral constituency within Turkey, which almost certainly will continue to stick with him. And I suspect that he will prevail against this latest wave of protests. But always in a system as focused on one individual as the one in Turkey has now become, one does wonder whether Erdogan, through these actions, in order to consolidate his own control, might be putting Turkey's long-term stability at risk. Anyway, that's Turkey. More concerning is the situation in the Middle East. And here I have to say I was somewhat less impressed by some of the things that Steve Witkoff had to say over the course of his very long interview with Tucker Carlson. I thought that in spite of Witkoff's inability to remember the names of 2 of the 4 regions in that are in contention in the conflict in Ukraine, Kherson and Zaporozhye, something which, by the way, I don't especially hold against him. After all, he's only been involved in Russian-American contacts over a relatively short time. I was overall reasonably impressed by his grasp of the essential facts in terms of the US-Russia negotiations. I have to say that I was rather less impressed by what he had to say about the situation in the Middle East. I was rather taken aback by, for example, by his admission that he's had no face-to-face meetings with Hamas officials. This in the same interview when he spoke of the importance of having meetings with one's adversaries, such as President Putin. But anyway, I do get the sense that the Americans don't have a full grasp of the situation in the Middle East. they're drifting further into a deepening confrontation with the Houthis in Yemen. There's now talk that Israel and Hezbollah, the ceasefire between them, is starting to crumble. And Israel continues to engage in airstrikes and advances in Syria, which are infuriating Syrian society, undermining al-Jolani's government in Damascus, and apparently causing considerable anger in Turkey as well, where these Israeli advances are seen as undermining the internal stability of al-Jolani's extraordinarily precarious regime in Damascus. Now, I have to say that my own understanding of the situation in the Middle East has become very influenced by the commentary of, well, basically Alistair Crook on the one hand, and of Max Blumenthal and the Grey Zone on the other. Though I should say that I do come to my own understanding of the region based on long history of interest in this conflict, which has raged throughout my entire life. And I can't help but think that yet again Israel is taking on too many adversaries. In fact, it is on the attack in all directions at once, even whilst divisions within Israeli society are growing. So the Israeli military are active in Syria. They're preparing to strike at Hezbollah. They are threatening to get into a conflict with Iran. And the Israeli Defense Minister, Mr. Katz, is now talking again about annexing territory in Gaza. All of this, even as there are rumours, and I think these are rumours, I don't believe that they are true, that there could even be a coup in Israel itself, because the situation there has become so fraught, and because the leadership of the Israeli army is in such bitter conflict with Prime Minister Netanyahu, who continues, by the way, to find himself locked in a conflict with the Israeli judiciary. Now, I appreciate yet again that I'm using very careful language in what I'm saying, and that many people get very frustrated with this. Though events in the United States and in Britain and other places, and Germany too, should explain why I feel obliged to be so careful. What I am going to say is this: not only are all of these actions tragedies and crimes, many of them crimes, but also tragedies. And I'm not suggesting, by the way, that all of the crimes are being committed just by one side. But specifically for Israel, they are ultimately catastrophic. It seems to me that what is being now, well, the future that is being held out to people in Israel is one of perpetual, constant war against everybody around them. I don't know how that is sustainable. I cannot believe that it can be sustained. I think the disaster this will inflict on Israeli society is going to be immense. And I don't believe that it is Israel's only or best option. I think and have always believed that diplomatic options were there. I think that there are plenty of people who would be keen to try and help to stabilize the situation. in and around Israel. But that does require addressing the plight of the Palestinians, which is something that Prime Minister Netanyahu and his cabinet and far too many within the Israeli political class adamantly refuse to do. Now, I wish I could say a lot more about this, but I don't feel I can, at least not for the moment. And I will return to this topic, no doubt, in other programs, but that is what I'm going to say about this for the moment. I don't myself believe that there is going to be an all-out conflict with Iran this year. I think the Americans and the Russians will prevent that happening. But in and of itself, that will not deliver peace, and it will certainly not deliver security for the people of Israel, and it will not end the appalling tragedy suffered by the Palestinian people. So, overall, a very troubling situation. And it's difficult for me to say that it is all I feel at this moment that I can say. I do hope to be able to speak more clearly about this in due course, but I don't think it's sustainable for me to say nothing. Anyway, this is where I finish the program today. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find more of our programs, all of our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. If you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.